The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Beatty, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member, and thank you to the witnesses for your patience here with us today as we explore this. My first question will go to you, Madam Treasurer Benatar. Like many of my colleagues, I represent a great deal of banks and insurance companies and other financial institutions that certainly, as you know, provide financial services to consumers across the country. It is my opinion that these institutions are already taking climate related financial risk. By your own words as experts, you have said in relationship to climate related risks, they are extreme, they are emerging, they are rising risks. Could put our institutions at issue. We are still evaluating the situation. Most people must learn to understand, and it is trending nationally. So with that, to me, it makes good business sense to take these factors into consideration because these institutions also have been very vocal in their opposition to state-level Republican-led bills that limit the use of climate-related factors in their businesses. Can you discuss for me why financial firms want to consider these risks and why it's good for the bottom line?
Thank you for the question. For us, it's about our taxpayers. It's about our constituents. We all represent our constituents back home. And at the end of the day, if we are not including those climate risks, if these financial institutions are not including this in their analysis of whether they even want to loan money to my fire district, do they want to risk lending money to a government entity if there's fires and flooding happening in that community, knowing that costs will go up, without understanding what I'm doing as a fiduciary to address those issues? That's something that I am being asked by our financial institutions when we talk about credit lines, for example. But I should also be asking the same thing when I'm looking to who I do business with, but I should be managing it. Prior to me being treasurer, we had seen flooding and fires that did take lives in my community and houses. We were not prepared for that. We had to sell at a loss, and I don't want to do that again.
Mr. Jones, can you discuss the impact it would have if climate-related multi-billion-dollar risks are ignored? How would it affect lending or credit unions and business?
Sure. In our preliminary research, we determined that roughly a third of credit unions are located in communities that are at relatively high or very high risk from natural disasters. And minority depository institutions, it's about half of them.
That was going to be my next questions to talk about MDI.
I didn't mean to get ahead of you.
That's great.
So and it's particularly, like I said, profound with minority depository institutions. And so because of that, in the agency's view, credit unions really know their communities well, but our interest is in learning about it. But so I think that credit unions really have to pay attention to these risks and any other risks that could be material.
Okay, that gives me a different focus I want to go on, and you can thank Mr. Jones, Mr. Gibson, for your next question. Research shows us that the impact of physical and transition risk are uneven across locations, income, race, and age. This is due to geographic reasons as well as regions' ability to adapt to these risks. The natural progression of this thought process is that efforts to adapt to climate change and take these risks into consideration would also have an effect on existing inequality. What are your thoughts on this, and how is the Fed taking these inequality implications under consideration?
So our supervisory perspective is really around ensuring that banks are measuring and managing all their material risks, including the climate-related financial risks that you asked about. It certainly could have broader effects on things like inequality, but really what we're looking at now is how banks are developing their capacity to really measure and understand these risks. So we see firms investing in data and models to better understand the factors that you're asking about. I think we all still have a lot to learn about what the impacts will be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time is almost up, so I yield back.
The gentlelady yields. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Federal Reserve has established a pilot climate scenario analysis exercise That's a lot of words for a guy from Texas, which requires 6 of the largest banks to major and manage climate-related financial risk. This requirement is extremely out of touch and increases burdens on financial institutions. And the Vice Chair for Supervision, Mr. Michael Barr, has taken the lead on this initiative without a vote from the board and claims that the exercise will support the board's responsibilities. But climate regulation is not a part of these responsibilities. This is a slippery slope and shows that the priorities of the Federal Reserve are shifting towards greenwashing our financial system, which is ignoring true risks like debt limit impasses and unsustainable federal spending leading to a higher national debt. So, Mr. Gibson, a few months ago when Chairman Powell was testifying before this committee, he said that the Federal Reserve is not and will not be a climate regulator. Do you believe that the Federal Reserve should be or should not be a climate regulator? And is this climate scenario analysis part of the Fed's holistic review for increasing capital requirements?
So I agree with Chair Powell that the Federal Reserve is not a climate policymaker, and the pilot climate scenario analysis exercise won't have any implications for banks' capital, so it's different from the holistic capital review.
Good. Now, the FDIC, Federal Reserve, and OCC have all issued their own draft principles for climate-related financial risk. These are all policies that should not be decided by independent regulators. These principles are taken straight out of the Biden administration's hands in an attempt to promote policies via banking regulations. Regulators cannot be truly independent if they regulate from the Biden playbook. One such principle posed by the Fed suggests that a bank's board of directors should consider tying compensation policies to risks that are associated with the climate change. And decisions like compensation should be made solely by the board of directors and should not be influenced by any outside parties. So financial regulators have an obligation to stay truly independent of the political arena and by getting involved. Mr. Coleman, you are jeopardizing the OCC's credibility and becoming proxies for the Biden administration radical climate groups. So is the OCC following the direction of an executive order, the FSOC, or other interest groups to insert climate-based policies into bank regulations? And does the OCC principles ask bank boards to consider tying compensation to climate change measures?
Thank you for the question. The OCC is focused on the safety and soundness of the institutions we supervise. We are not focused on social or environmental issues. We're simply focused on ensuring that these climate-related financial risks are identified, properly managed, properly monitored, and controlled. We issued the principles with the idea of providing feedback based upon information we'd received from the institutions that we supervise dating back as early as 2019, with them raising issues with us about how they should manage those risks and how they should properly identify those risks consistent with our expectations for a risk management framework.
My last question here briefly is financial regulators should not be in the business of picking winners and losers. We see that with this administration constantly, but unfortunately now they are. Now these actions are being made under the disguise of transitioning away from reliable energy like oil and gas and channeling credit towards green energies. So by following the lead of international agencies and pressuring financial institutions to adopt climate-related policies, regulators are fixing the market and abandoning all of the above approach. U.S. energy needs cannot be met solely by renewables, and regulators should not be in the practice of giving one energy sector an advantage over the other. Remember, I'm from Texas. So, Mr. Gibson, has the Federal Reserve been facing pressure to channel credit away from certain energy sectors and moving it towards green sectors?
So it's not the Federal Reserve's policy to discourage banking organizations from offering accounts or services to any class or type of law-abiding business.
All right. If you would just stay with what you're designed to do, small business guys like me can survive. I hope you do. I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back, and now the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Kasten, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start just with a little bit of history to level set us. For the vast majority of human history on this planet, atmospheric CO2 was pretty stable at about 260 parts per million. It started going up during the Industrial Revolution. Took about 200 years until I was born, 1971, after the Industrial Revolution started, by which point it had gone up about 80 parts per million, was then at 320. In the 51 years I've been on this planet, it's gone up by another 100 parts per million. because of all the fossil fuel we burn. 50% of all the CO2 we have ever emitted as a species has been since I graduated from college in 1993. Do you all agree that anthropogenic combustion of carbon is the primary cause of global warming? Yes or no? Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, I'm happy to have the silence, because last Wednesday, one of my Republican colleagues on this subcommittee said in a hearing, I know a comment was made about belief in anthropogenic global warming or climate change or whatever you want to say it is. I don't think the science is settled. This is obscene. If you had a member of Congress who said, I don't believe in the laws of gravity, we would go out of their way, out of love and respect for them and their family, to keep them away from the speaker's balcony. And yet in today's Republican caucus, denying laws of physics puts you on a path to leadership. Let me now shift to areas under you all's jurisdiction. In October of 2021, the Financial Stability Oversight Council's report on climate-related financial risk, which you are all members of, with the exception of you, Ms. Benatar, for the first time identified climate change as an emerging threat to U.S. financial stability. Do all of you believe that the physical and transition risks from climate change can threaten financial stability? Yes? Nods across the board. I say that because we are here with people criticizing you for doing too much. I think there's a fair criticism that you're not doing enough. Dr. Gibson, I've talked to some of your colleagues. We're seeing huge movements of capital from the insurance industry. Parts of Florida, parts of California, parts of Louisiana no longer being insured. If we are only going to limit our examination of financial risk to the banking sector or to the 6 big banks, we're staying blind too long to the larger disruptions in our economy, and I think we need to do much more than we are doing to make sure that we protect folks, but that's a longer conversation than we have time for in the time here. Treasurer Benatar, you are trusted to safely and prudently manage the public's money. Do you have a responsibility to evaluate all risks?
Absolutely. I have to evaluate all risks. And just want to say, right now in Arizona, we are seeing the heat.
No doubt.
No doubt.
And are the anti-ESG bills that are being passed restricting your choice?
Absolutely.
You mentioned in your testimony some of the costs of these bills, $6.7 billion in Indiana, $3.6 billion in Kansas, $70 million in Kentucky. Who's bearing the brunt of these costs?
Our taxpayers, your constituents.
And the firefighters and the policemen and the pension holders and everybody who
absolutely, and our
depends on
taxing
us.
districts.
Now, you're the minority witness. I say that with love and respect. There are folks from very Republican areas who completely agree with you. In Kentucky, the board chair of the Kentucky County Employee Retirement Fund system said the anti-ESG law is inconsistent with its fiduciary responsibilities with respect to the investment of assets or other duties imposed by law. In Indiana, an official from the Indiana Chamber of Commerce, not a lefty woke organization, said, we believe the anti-ESG bills are anti-free market and anti-free enterprise. Is anybody listening? My God. In Texas, executive director of the Texas County and District Retirement System said, we have concerns that the anti-ESG bill could impair our ability to maximize our returns and have a financial impact for our employers. This is real stuff. Fiduciary. Thank you, Madam Ranking Member. Now, look, all of us on this side of the dais have the privilege of writing laws. We get to debate laws. We get to argue about what should be in those laws. It is a tremendous responsibility. It's a tremendous duty. I still pinch myself every day that I get to do this. That power does not extend to the laws of physics. It does not extend to the laws of capitalism and free market economics. We have the ability to ignore them. We have the ability to write a law that says, go to the speaker's balcony and jump. We have the ability to write a law that says, let's destroy free markets. Let's make the U.S. no longer attractive to innovators and entrepreneurs and make us the envy of the free world. Let's stop all that by ignoring the laws of economics, by opposing free markets. Just because we have that power doesn't mean that it's our obligation to use it. I've been saying this all ESG month. I really hope that it someday, once again, becomes bipartisan to support competitive markets and the laws of physics. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Fitzgerald, is recognized for 5 minutes. Smaller room.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On September 29th, 2022, the Fed established the pilot climate scenario analysis exercise to measure and manage climate-related financial risks. However, the covered institutions already measure relevant financial risks and do not need enhancement and help promised by the Fed. I'm not an accountant, but I had a roommate in college that was, and he was studying to be an accountant. And I just remember the basic principles of accounting, which was a book about this thick. It was very principled. There's certain things you do when it comes to accounting and certain things you don't. There's certain things you consider and other things that you would never consider. And my colleague who just spoke kind of reminded me that, you know, when it comes to ESG, or as he framed it, ESG month, there should be some variance in there. And I've always thought, not only as a state legislator, but now as a member of Congress, that, you know, there are certain things we can do voluntarily that if we want to move forward, if we have questions about the environment or social governance that are important, I think that should be factored in. But it shouldn't change the basic principles of the way the boardroom works. And I think that's why, not only in this committee, but in other committees that I serve on, the focus on ESG is because we don't know what the impact would be if we kind of change the rules of where we're at on many of these things. So the Fed has stated that increased capital requirements form the holistic capital review, and the Basel III endgame requirements will be implemented in the long term. So to Mr. Gibson, does the perceived long-term implementation of increased capital requirements contemplate the potential to turn climate scenarios into regular climate stress testing?
That's not part of the current work plan, no.
And have there been any discussions about increasing capital requirements on banks over the next several years, and then doing so again under the climate stress testing regime?
No, the climate scenario analysis exercise doesn't have any implications for capital requirements.
Right. And in January 2023, Federal Reserve research paper titled, "What are the large global banks doing about climate change?" the authors wrote, "Our paper is closely related to a report by Influence Map 2022. Influence Map is a London-based think tank devoted to the mission to, quote, hold the corporate and finance sectors accountable for climate performance." I mean, it's just a completely separate agenda from what anybody should be considering when it comes to finance. And in attempts to use the name and kind of these shame tactics and the way it's funded by several entities, including ClimateWorks Foundation, which in turn is funded by several entities, including Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and the High Tide Foundation, amongst others. There's an agenda there. There's absolutely an agenda. And if we don't look at this clearly, I think we're all going to fall for this game of propaganda and a movement away from what I said earlier, the basic foundation of accounting principles. So to Mr. Gibson, is the Federal Reserve following the lead of outside international think tanks and advocates and activists of climate policy change in efforts to try and pressure or push financial institutions toward climate policy directions right now?
No.
And the final thing I'll just say, because I'm going to run out of time. There is absolutely a pressure. I've spoken to CFOs and the CEOs, and sometimes they're even unaware how their own corporations have responded to this. I remember we had a dinner that I attended in which I asked the CEO, tell me what you think about CSG. And he said, oh, it's not something we're involved in. It's not something that we talk about at any of our corporate meetings. But the fact of the matter is, 2 days later, I had a staff person come to me and say, look at the website. Their website had a full 2 pages on ESG. So it really raised a question in my mind. are some of the corporate leaders even aware of kind of what's going on, even within their own companies? I think the answer to that is no. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. From the scorching heat in the South to the historic flooding in the Northeast, including in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which I represent, it is clear that time is really running out to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Now, 4 of our witnesses here today represent federal agencies who sit on FSOC. The report that you put out 2 years ago stated that, quote, climate-related financial risks will become more acute if not addressed promptly. Now, while it is certainly encouraging to see your agencies take the risks of climate change seriously, 2 years later, it is very discouraging. That's probably the understatement of the year, that Republicans in Congress and on this very committee are obstructing efforts to prevent and mitigate devastating harm to working families and to our economy. As my grandmother used to say, denial is not just a river in Egypt. Mr. Coleman, the OCC's mandate focuses on the safety and soundness of the financial system. When it comes to climate change, if a bank has weaknesses in its risk management system, obviously this could adversely affect not only a bank's safety and soundness, but also the overall financial system. So, yes or no, in light of this, do you agree that the OCC has the authority and is in fact obligated to address those risks?
The OCC is obligated to address climate-related financial
Yes.
risks, just as we are with any emerging risks.
So yes or no?
Yes.
Thank you. This past weekend, we saw heavy rain and flash flooding in my district, the Massachusetts 7th, and just last week, flooding in the region in Vermont caused the OCC to allow financial institutions to close. As climate change continues to cause more and more physical damage to our communities, we see more financial institutions close in frontline communities for the very same reasons. However, the people who are the most hurt by these closures are low-income, working-class families, especially when it occurs at a time when they may need financial services the most. Mr. Coleman, what steps is the OCC taking to ensure that financial institutions can continue to serve their communities through growing climate-related financial risks, like the flash flooding that my constituents experienced last week?
Thank you for the question. Our focus at the OCC is on the largest, most complex banks with over $100 billion in assets and how they are addressing climate-related financial risks. In terms of community banks, we believe that these community bankers, they've operated for decades in their communities. They are very familiar with the impact of weather-related events on their communities, on their businesses, on their local clientele. We think they have the best knowledge of how to meet the needs of those communities. In addition to that, our acting comptroller has made an effort to get out and meet with community bankers to make certain they are aware of our efforts and make certain they are aware of what we are doing as it related to climate-related financial risk.